Allen Ruppersberg was born in 1944, and he has been collecting, rearranging, and retelling real life for more than 50 years. A pioneer of conceptual art, he has consistently focused on what he calls a vocabulary of the ordinary, by using both words and everyday materials in his art. Though it appears in many modes, his work is unified by his regular use of American vernacular culture, including books, posters, newspapers and magazines, records, old films, and other vintage items, which he collects to use as source material. Al was born in Cleveland and is now based in New York and Los Angeles. He moved to LA in 1965 to attend Chouinard Art Institute, hoping to become a commercial artist. His interests, however, soon shifted as he joined a growing scene of artists who were exploring the interface of language and image against the backdrop of Hollywood and the 1960s counterculture. His early projects included environments made with found objects, wry narrative photo works, and a novel copied by hand, among other things. But this began a career-long engagement with creating works that prompt an experience of both reading and looking, and they intertwine fact with fiction. Along with other young conceptual artists, Ruppersberg broke onto the international scene when he was included in the now legendary exhibition Live in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form at the Kunsthalle Bern in 1969. He has exhibited in the US and Europe ever since, but has not had a major US retrospective since 1985. Recent solo exhibitions here include Air de Paris in Paris, the Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art in Winnipeg in 2016, the Skirball Cultural Center in LA in 2015, Green Naftali in New York in 2014, and just this year, Wiels Brussels in 2014, and the Art Institute of Chicago in 2012. His work is in the collections of the Berkeley Art Museum, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, New York, the Metropolitan Museum of New York, Milwaukee Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Museum of Modern Art New York, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, and here at the Walker also. The exhibition you'll see upstairs charts 50 years of Ruppersberg's work. It looks at his key themes: movement between places, presence and absence, the book as object and subject, memorials and self-portraiture. It also reveals his reverence for cultural forms, as he says, that are destined to disappear, from postcards and wall calendars to hand-painted signs and early recorded music. In examining the passing of time through these emblems of the everyday, Ruppersberg's work encourages our participation. It also invites a rediscovery of the present moment, and as someone remarked to me the other day, possibly gives us a glimpse into the future. The exhibition also has a major catalog, and it's the most comprehensive book on his work to date. In addition to a full overview of the exhibition, it has an illustrated chronology of the artist's life and work. We're looking at a number of the images from that here on the wall. Selections from the artist's own writings and new scholarly texts by Thomas Crow of New York University, Matthew S. Witkowski from the Art Institute of Chicago, and Aram Moshayedi of the Hammer Museum, who I will introduce now. Aram joined the Hammer Museum LA as curator in July 2013 and has organized exhibitions from the Hammer Contemporary Collection focused on the work of Pentti Mokonen, Hirsch Perlman, and Fishley Weiss, as well as Hammer projects, Mario Garcia Torres, Maria Hasabi, Avery Singer, and Simon Denny. His current exhibition, Stories of Almost Everyone, is currently on view at the Hammer. He served as associate curator of the gallery at Red Cat from 2010 to 2013, and as an assistant curator on the 2008 California Biennial at the Orange County Museum of Art in Newport Beach. His writings on art have been published in numerous exhibition catalogs and such publications as Artforum, Art in America, and Frieze. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Allen Ruppersberg and Aram Moshayedi. Please join us on stage. Thank you so much.
Are they on? I guess they are.
So thank you for that great introduction, Siri, and thank you to everyone at the Walker for the last couple days, including Fabian, Jenny, Jackie, Aaron everyone here has been an incredible host to Al in particular, but to, by extension, all of us who are here as part of his orbit in various ways. It's pretty incredible to see so many friends from different periods of Al's life who are here, and it's quite emotional, I have to say. I know it's emotional for Al, and I cry at the drop of a hat, so don't be surprised if I don't cry today. In some ways, I see it's a very kind and generous thing that I've become a small part in assembly of characters that have come into contact with your work over the last 50 years, and it's an intergenerational story that goes back to Chenard and continues into the present. And I even think about my own experience of going to your studio for the first time in, I think it was like 2005, 2006, and I was a graduate student, kind of somewhat precocious, and it has left a mark. And so, yeah. I think I need to kind of disarm you somewhat. So,
Good luck.
I just, I'd like to ask you a series of questions, maybe to revisit them based on, how they appear in the exhibition. So, have you ever been an artist?
Am I supposed to remember where that came from?
Are you still an artist?
Oh, I know where you got that from. That's an anonymous interview.
Okay. Do you enjoy being an artist?
It's not an interview with me.
Okay. Is
It's
it
a man
difficult
on the
being
street.
an artist? Okay. All right. Have you been working long? It's interesting because this anonymous character in 1973 does say that he's been working for a long time.
Yeah.
Which would have been, you would have been in the kind of sweet spot of a whole 5 years after Chenard.
That's about right.
So it's.
But no, it's about being an artist, but not this one.
Necessarily that. Even though your photo is right next to it.
Right.
Yeah. It's good. Good way to throw us off.
But I have a mask on
Oh, yeah, it's true.
in the pictures, so it's not me.
It's true. It's true. Okay, well, there are more. Well, there's just 2 more. Have you ever been Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? And then which one? But we doesn't pertain to Al per se. So I guess to start in a real way, I thought maybe it would be good just to talk about the impact of Chenard, maybe, on, in particular, how a certain number of people who are even here with us today have kind of formed relationships out of that. And Chenard, even as a gravitational pull, as an art school that brought you from Ohio, others from Texas, kind of what you thought you were getting into when you got there, and maybe what you ended up doing or being on the other side of it when you graduated in 1967, was it?
Yeah, more or less. I dropped out for a while, so I think it was around 67. But Chenard was, whatever I thought I was starting at, it totally changed my life. So that's the main thing, is that, I came there for one idea, because growing up in Cleveland, I didn't really know much about what contemporary art was, if there was such a thing at that time. It was modern art, and going to school to, become a commercial artist, and then eventually an illustrator, and then, Chenard had it set up so that you had to take a series of introductory courses over the first 2 years, and then you could decide what you were going to be. And then, so in the course of that, when I was going to be an illustrator, then we had to take a painting class. And once I took the painting class, commercial art was gone from then on. And then you start to learn from all the other people that are there in the school that you meet. And so at the end, your life is completely changed. I mean, it's not just the art school, it was the whole environment of coming to LA, arriving. Chenard had no place for you to stay, so you had to find your own place to stay. So I went to a boarding house and stayed in a boarding house for a while, and then you meet roommates and move to apartments, and so it's just LA, and then what kind of artist you wind up being, and who the people and I mean it, is indescribable what it does, or what that particular school did at that time.
How is it? So when you say took a painting class, is that referring to Emerson Wolfler?
Emerson Wolfer taught. I don't know. It's like second year. Or it was an introductory painting class with one of the more academic teachers that just taught basic stuff. But I remember now. There was a plein air. It was a plein air class. And so we went out somewhere, and I don't know how I did it, but I did something. And
it's amazing. I mean, it's in a way, they're probably showing you how to make a painting, and then you became more interested in the outdoors. I mean, I would say, given what becomes your work after that moment.
Well, that's part of L.A.
Right.
I mean, it's not anything to do with the plein air painting, but that's later just because you're in L.A. and you're out and you're everywhere, and from the mountains to the sea, as they used to say. And so you're in your car, you're driving around, you see everything. You go from Topanga to North Hollywood to the Palomino Club, and you could do that in 20 minutes. So nobody thought anything about it.
Right.
You just were out. I mean, but that's the nature of L.A. There's the beach, there's the mountains, there's the woods, there's the desert, all of it.
Right.
That's a part of the attraction.
And how was it, or how would you kind of characterize that shift then? I mean, for something that was a more or less kind of traditional art education to then what in a very short amount of time became, somewhat, I don't know how you would want to kind of characterize it, but we could even just say like the idea of the environment that became so dominant in your early work. But what was the kind of transitional, thrust that took you from one to the other?
Well, I don't even know if I knew if it was a traditional art education or not. I mean, it was just art school. And, but then, I think it's true for most of us that came there from somewhere else that LA is or was totally fascinating. And so, the work just becomes part of your figuring out what LA is and just diving into any, situation you could find. And so then that's how it shows up in the work. I don't know. That's just a kind of organic transition somehow.
Right.
That I don't really know how it happened, except that you're fascinated with LA.
Do you think that it also, was the idea of Los Angeles was somewhat like of an undiscovered place at that time, so that in a way that you were able to pursue certain avenues of the city that would be very different than, maybe others?
Oh, it certainly was unique. And at that time, maybe it was undiscovered. It certainly was undiscovered to me. That's why I left Cleveland, so I could go to L.A. Whether I went to art school or not, that's just kind of coincidental that I got accepted. But I would have gone anyway.
Huh.
And I forgot what the question. I forgot what the question was.
Perfect. But the idea of do you ever think about what you would have become if you didn't get accepted to art school?
Who knows?
Well, I
wouldn't be sitting here talking to you.
Right.
I can tell you that.
Well, it's interesting. It'll come probably up in the talk because I think so much of the work, and especially for those who have seen the exhibition, it's almost even today I thought to ask the question of which Al are we going to get, because there's so many different roles that you've taken through the kind of lens of an artist, like proprietor, collector, private investigator, all of these kinds of ways of describing and kind of characterizing yourself. And so in some ways it's kind of that the question has been answered by the output of your work. And I wouldn't say, that's not to say that being an artist is secondary to all of those things, but it's definitely been seemingly a kind of negotiation of that idea or definition of what an artist is, maybe. Or maybe you don't think.
Maybe the stuff that was made, at the beginning, all those years ago, I mean, it was art to me, but now it really looks like art. But at the time, I don't know if, the idea was to make stuff that didn't look like art, with a capital A.
Yeah.
And so, but now when you see it in the galleries here, there's no question. Well, this has been true for a number of years, but it looks different all these years later than what you started out to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's especially, I would say, the location piece, right? Which maybe if you would talk about, but I think in this context where originally, I think what year am I blanking? 19...
For the location piece?
For the, oh my God, the Norton Simon piece.
Yeah, the location piece. That's 69.
That so much of that in its original intent was about displacing the exhibition into your studio, creating an environment in the studio.
Well, nobody knew it was really a studio.
Right.
They just knew it was some office building on Sunset.
Right. But and then in this context of the exhibition, it becomes an object.
Absolutely.
I mean, you really have to reconcile it as a...
Right.
So, but this idea of displacement is kind of it's an interesting one, and I wonder if even you could talk a bit about, the importance. I think maybe if we're kind of doing a good job of keeping a chronological, story here that we're telling, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the influence of someone like Alan Capro and this the idea of the environment, that you were pursuing so early in some of those pieces.
Well, certainly Allen Capro was a big influence, and we knew each other. But that big fat book called Assemblage that Alan made, I don't know, 59 or whenever it was, the big fat thing with the coarse cover. I don't know what it was. Some kind of, it wasn't a normal book cover, and I think it was called Environments. And so that book, that kind of tells where a lot of stuff comes from, and even describing things like the cafe or the hotel or some of the other works. I use the word environments because that's what we knew. That's what Alan had defined, and then later on it becomes installation and installation art and performative installation and all that other stuff. But it comes out of that big book, basically, and then I would meet him later, but first I had the book.
Mm-hmm. You said earlier that he had come to the cafe, is that right?
Yes, he came to the cafe. That might be when we first met, I don't remember for sure, but he definitely came to the cafe.
Huh.
Rauschenberg, the other big influence, also came to the cafe. And so, I'm, 25 at that point, and meeting the generation that I admired so much it was a big deal.
Do you remember what they ordered?
Huh?
Do you remember what they ordered?
No, I don't.
No. All right.
It's probably up there on the board.
Okay. Oh, yeah, the receipts. Of
The
course.
receipts are
Yeah,
up
yeah,
there,
of
but they
course.
don't have names on them.
Yeah,
So
right. It's interesting, even, I mean, what you just described is like the evolution of the idea of the environment and how it becomes kind of, branded within art history as the installation or site specificity or any of those things. But it also relates, I think, you're prefacing it as early as 1971 with the hotel, with the sign that was above the check-in counter that says, "I'm not creating environments, only breaking them down." So in some sense, there was probably this reverence for Capro, but also the sense of how, your work was
different
and pushing against this.
Yeah, but it's both in there for sure.
Right.
But I didn't want to be thinking about creating. I didn't want somebody to say, "Oh, you're creating environments," because that's what he did, and this moves on from there, or at least I hoped it did anyway.
Yeah, I think he'd be proud.
Yeah, I hope so.
So just to kind of go back to this idea of the early examples of, I think it could be even characterized by some within art history as this relationship between site and non-site, or, the idea of displacing the kind of location of the exhibition into the location of the studio and pushing it against even just like the kind of, the conventional modes of exhibition that have become, so important to art history in a way. that I also wonder if you think about this act of existing at the periphery at all. I mean, it goes to everything about where your studios have been historically. Currently, and we say you're in LA, but the studio is kind of famously in El Segundo. And I just always go back to this one thing. And I did in the essay, and I'm sorry that I'm going to have to do it again here. But in 1969, for Seth Sieglaub's exhibition titled 1 Month, you kind of used this opportunity. It was Seth Sieglaub approached different artists to produce a work for each day of the month, right?
Yeah.
And so for Al's day, he proposed a project that kind of reflected upon the loneliness of kind of the existence of the artist. And he proposed in that exhibition, which is only a book really, to walk within the margins of available daylight hours through the Mojave Desert in a predetermined straight line. And you conclude the description of this by saying, art as life is a solitary act. We work alone, we primarily live alone, and the work we do is for our benefit. And I'm wondering, how you kind of like think about that.
Well, what I said, when I was 25, figuring out what I wanted to make, I mean, it certainly is all correct, but I don't know if I would phrase it that way, but, it certainly, reverberates through the work without a doubt. But I didn't ever do that piece.
Yeah.
But it also was just part of the time when I was wandering around in the desert, picking up stuff or assembling works like the location piece. So it kind of fit in at the time, but it also was probably the closest that it would ever come to any kind of what people know as land art.
Right.
I didn't really go that way, but people think of some things as kind of related to land art, but certainly we all knew about those things and really liked and admired those works, but it's not the Robert Smithson kind of inside. I mean, a lot of it is inside outside, but it's not non-site.
Right.
Even though of course all of that is going on at the same time.
Right. Would you especially? Now. I would think. Oh well. Before we move on, I just wanted to say is that I remembered when I asked you that about that piece the first time we met, and you said you didn't think that you actually did it, and I remember it blew my mind because I thought like, what do you mean? You proposed that you were doing this. Artists do what they say they're going to do, and it was such a revelation that that you don't have to do it.
Well, I guess that was part of the work. I don't remember. I have no idea.
Right.
But I just know I didn't do it.
Right.
And why I didn't do it, I can't answer because I don't know.
Right.
It just.
I'm from the Mojave Desert. It's
you are?
Yeah. No, don't do that. Yeah, I'm from Barstow.
Oh,
I was
really?
born in Barstow. That's why I feel that piece is now in the collection of the Hammer, thanks to Beth DeWoody, of City Limits.
Wow.
And
that's right.
And
That's
I was like, of course, Barstow made it into art history for once.
All the margins of L.A.
Yeah, exactly.
Palmdale, Barstow,
Pear Blossom.
Yeah.
All my local, my former haunts.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So the loneliness question, or the kind of the solitariness question, how would you kind of think about that if you had to also characterize, the relationships that you have with people in the room today? And even the fact that I think so much of the work that has kind of emerged over the last 50 years has really been, as much about your own persona and your own way of diverting that kind of persona. But on the other hand, you do have these like relationships that you're formed both to historical figures. There's names like Tristan Tzara, Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, but also, I think about that piece that was in what was maybe your last show at Margot Levin with Guy de Conte, Wolfgang Storkel, Bastian Otter, and Jack Goldstein. And so in some ways, the works become, from that moment and earlier, they have this relationship to people who were, close to you. And so in fact, it's that's I don't know. I just kind of like thought about that idea of like making this claim in 1969 about art as a solitary act, and then the entirety of your career really becomes about these relationships with people, that you've kind of maintained.
But I'm always not there. There's somebody else there, but I'm always 2 or 3 steps behind everything. So even though in those days we used ourselves in the photographs, that was just because it was easy. Mm-hmm. You didn't have to hire actors or anything. You could just do it yourself. That quickly went away because you don't want to point at yourself. So, the other works, I'm always behind some other kind of character. So, it's, where is the artist? So you could go back to your solitary quote there, that the artist is somewhere by himself making this stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's not about being out front. That's what I've always felt anyway.
Right. Where's Al?
Yeah, well, exactly. But I don't make that up.
Right.
I mean, other people make that up.
Right.
Where is he? I don't know. That's just me, being restless.
Right.
That's all.
There's one little break here. I think Catherine from Los Angeles would like to know which work of yours is the most free of influence.
Who's Catherine?
Catherine Andrews.
Oh, Catherine Andrews. Oh, you're getting that out of the book. Yeah. Right, out of the catalog. What did she say?
She asked which work of yours is the most free of influence.
Oh, it's a good question.
It's pretty good.
That's why I don't answer them.
Okay. All right. They might come back up, actually. So, I guess to go to this point of the kind of relationships that are formed, I wonder if you could talk in the way that it relates maybe more recently to your relationship to collecting. I think there's a lot of works that kind of reflect this impulse, and what's the vocabulary of the ordinary, right? But, obviously there are works within the exhibition that are in themselves kind of collections in a way, but I know independent of that, you're an avid collector, and in some ways it consumes your life. And it's definitely apparent in the new 5-foot shelf, where you can kind of see what was your kind of former studio and how it's almost bursting in a way that would give me great anxiety with, magazines, records, various types of ephemera. And I know it's still the way that El Segundo looks today. And what is it about that for you, this kind of idea of collecting, and what are you kind of going for with this large amassing?
Well, it gives me great anxiety at this point also, because I don't know what to do with all that stuff. And it's all about collecting stuff to make works out of. And now I know that I'll never use it all, I'll never use all of it to make, works that I thought would maybe come out of it. And sometimes it took 20 years for something to come out of something that I had found somewhere. But it's not about making collections per se. Mm-hmm. It's just about finding stuff to use to make, art out of, to make works out of. And it just accumulates, and it accumulates. And now it's at its limits, I think. So I don't know. It just still sits there waiting to have something made out of it.
But at the same time, you could say that a lot of these materials are kind of like, artifacts that are really kind of imagined for their own disposability. Like, they're not really meant to be retained in the way that, art objects are retained. So I wonder, do you think about the kind of life of the collection that you've formed, as an artifact or as a kind of cross-section of cultural history? Because, in one way, what you've been able to do is you're gathering, a broad section of lost Americana that would otherwise, not enter into any kind of privileged place of memory. But in some ways, of course it enters into the work and it's referred to, but then you think about all the source material that exists around the work, that, how that in and of itself is an act of preservation on your part that most institutions are not willing to undertake on their own.
Well, it's definitely about saving things that I think are worthwhile and that might disappear, but that also goes back to the beginnings of thinking about what you want to make. You're making things out of ephemeral and throwaway stuff for a reason, and that's to say that this can be art too. So whether it's walking in the desert and doing it or not doing it, it disappears, and so the early work, kind of reinforces the idea that maybe you should look at art a little bit differently. That the stuff that's around is maybe better than what you think it is, and that it then can be made into art, and now really looks like art.
Right.
So it's constantly finding things that I'd rather go to Staples than I go to Staples much more than I would go to art supply store, even though I do go to both, but it's kind of finding the most general thing I could possibly use as an art material. So all that collection of stuff is just supplies, that you just get to make stuff.
We should say that Staples did not sponsor this talk today.
What?
Staples did not sponsor this talk. How did that work? I mean, I wish I would have brought this up earlier, but I think about Stanley and Elise Grinstein, or Stanley Grinstein setting up an account, for artists throughout the city. I mean, how did you take advantage of that? I mean, I guess if you're kind of also thinking about different avenues for art production in a way. I mean, I'm also just asking the question because I think we should. I mean, we met because of Stanley, and so I don't know.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say take it. Yes, you can say take advantage of it in the kindest way.
Yeah, it's all right.
And no, a lot of things, not only for myself, but for many artists in LA, would never have happened without that. And of course, it's just out of their generosity and their, joy of being around and participating when the LA art world was, about that big. And I mean, they weren't the only ones, but Stanley really, set up a lot of things. So, he paid the rent on the cafe, he paid the rent on the hotel, and, he did whatever for other artists. And, it was just part of life in LA at that time. And so, yeah, no, I'm eternally grateful for them.
I mean, I feel like in some ways, like looking back, you were perfect for each other in a way, because also, Stanley and Elise were so good about hosting artists who were coming to Los Angeles. So it was extending the network into of the city in an international way. And I think about especially your relationship to kind of, conceptual art from Los Angeles. It's seen in regard to, your relationship to Amsterdam, or the participation in When Attitudes Become Form at Conceptual. So in some ways, you were also kind of pushing around the kind of geographical limitations that the city, in some cases, has kind of. There are many who haven't really. Feels like they never left, but I wondered also the social aspect, of like using works as a kind of like social tool in a way, and how their parties were so essential to kind of forming a social scene.
Well, that's where you
Angeles.
met everybody. I mean, that's one of the places you met everybody, but particularly when the artists came to town, the other artists, it's where you would meet Daniel Barin, where you would meet Richard Serra, where you would meet Lawrence Weiner, and so on and so forth, because they came to town to do shows, and, we all got to know each other, not maybe directly at Stanley's house, but he would sponsor projects around the city, and the artists would come, or, they'd come for gallery shows, and somehow it was just, it's just natural hanging out there, and I can't even tell you how many people I met there over the years.
Yeah.
And not just me, but everybody would have the same thing.
Right.
What is that new piece that Rouchet made? It's a photo of their house This is after they're gone. I mean, the kids are still there, but 5 years ago or something, he made a print out of a photograph of their house, and then there was a text which I wish I could remember. That was just absolutely perfect for what we all felt went on there.
Right.
Look it up. It's a great print.
Okay. Good. I mean, it's in some ways you could even say that Stanley was somewhat, archivally minded in that he is one of the few, if only, people to have retained the meals from the cafe, which are now...
It's the only extant.
Yeah.
Only extant collection. And, it's in pretty good shape. It's not perfect, but the perfect pictures are up in the wall there.
Right. So you'll all have to come to Los Angeles to see the actual dishes and how
That's
they've
right.
kind of held up.
Right.
And also just a plug to say that everybody who flew here, all 50 of you, for the show, I expect to see in Los Angeles. I think Al expects it as well, right?
I'll be there.
Okay, good. Yeah. I might show up too. So I wondered, just to kind of, I'm sorry to kind of like meander a little bit, but one of the things that's also apparent, and you touched upon it a bit, is just this interest in Los Angeles as a subject that you were kind of grappling with. And in some ways over the last 50 years, I think you've witnessed its evolution and change, both culturally and architecturally. And this idea, even just of coming up with images to have running behind us was this idea of old LA. And I wondered, how old LA continues to be kind of a part of how you think about the city, especially after so many landmarks, which were kind of part of the works, have come and gone, but also how certain individuals who were kind of part of that cultural landscape have come and gone. And as much as it's like a kind of, we could talk about the archival impulse, in your work, looking at these kind of discarded moments in American cultural history, that even just a way of charting those relationships becomes so important again. And I think I already asked this somewhat, but I don't know. I guess I wanted to talk a bit more about the meaningful relationships with specific individuals that maybe from the earliest moments of your career, had an impact on your artistic work to even maybe more recent ones, like the time that you met me and it just changed your life, I'm sure.
I think that to back up there, that the exploration of LA, like I said, was endemic when you arrived there from somewhere else, and all of those works that came out of that, are all the very early works. But then it changed, it expanded when I went to New York for the first time in 1970. And spent, 3 or 4 months living there because I had met Lawrence Weiner and Kasuth and other people, and we all got to know each other. And so, and of course, I wanted to see New York. And in those days, being an LA artist, you had to go to New York. And that went all the way up to when Baldessari is teaching at Cal Arts. And in the first or second, third generation of Cal Artsians, John told him, no, you have to go to New York. And so, part of it is the idea of, expanding your career, but it's also just, new exploration. So then New York becomes just as much as part of the work as LA does, and I don't think about old LA particularly anymore. It's not there, and that was a long time ago. So when I'm there now, I'm just basically there to be in my studio and work, and my fantastic assistants are there, and work gets made there more than some of the other places.
I guess not so much as how much a specific place. This isn't a question about how much a specific place would impart itself on your work, but you think about also the relationship that you kind of established to artists in the '90s that were of a different generation, like Dominique Gonzalez Forrester or Liam Gillick, for instance, that really came similarly out of just a going to Nice, right, for this exhibition, No Man's Time. And I wondered, I mean, what, it's definitely something that probably then followed in the decade after, about teaching at UCLA, where you were kind of in conversation with the younger generations of artists kind of progressively. I just wondered about that moment in the 1990s and meeting that kind of group of artists in that context of that exhibition, and how maybe, you know, what you saw your role being. You know, I've always thought it as you were there to, you know, really educate, I mean, whether you saw it or not, but to educate a group of artists on a figure like Capro, who had been kind of not part of a conversation about, you know, socially based practice or kind of relational type work that was kind of miscategorized or categorized. It's not for us to determine, but how much, you know, that even thinking of another generation of artists imparted itself onto the way that you even thought about your past work or the work that you would make from that point on.
Well, winding up with the you know, relationship that went on for, you know, decades with Europe and doing work there, that comes out of being in New York, because New York is obviously much more connected to Europe than LA is. And so it kind of was just an ongoing thing, you know. And so by beginning to show in New York with younger generation, I mean, with galleries that represented younger artists, then you get kind of included in that, and then that, you know, gets extended to Europe, and then you know, have the same goals as that generation, that next generation. So there's very little separation there that I felt. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, they were just working the same way I was, even though they probably looked at it a little bit differently, but I think we all kind of came from the same conceptual groundwork. Mm-hmm. They're just a generation younger, and they're Europeans. And so it was a great introduction to, you know, that generation of artists that then got categorized as relational aesthetics and all of that. And but it's just working with younger artists, period. Mm-hmm. And appreciating what they're doing, you know, or being able to see how it was connected. Because there's other generations in between that were not doing that. You know, we have the neo-expressionist group and that kind of stuff. And so it jumps over, and then you're glad that, well, here comes somebody who's not wanting to make some big sloppy painting.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, you know, I'd just like to kind of take a moment to also say that Siri really did an incredible job of crafting a narrative around the work, of presenting a historical overview that was very thorough, but also in a way with a very kind of delicate touch that I think is rare sometimes with seeing exhibitions of this kind. And I know that, you know, you've talked recently about this experience of seeing a Max Ernst exhibition at the Guggenheim when you were in your mid-20s, and the experience of now kind of seeing your life's, you know, the last 50 years of your work in the context of an exhibition where you can kind of have it unfolded and seen in context of other things that, you know, you may have yourself never even seen them next to. And I wondered, in that process, have there been things that you've kind of identified in the work that you maybe didn't know was there when you were originally kind of just pushing through it?
Well, yeah. At the beginning, you're working through lots of ideas really fast, and you know, then they're there. And I always had the idea, well, you know, there's a series here, there's these ideas there, I could go back to them once I worked through all the other stuff. Like when I was doing the hotel, for instance, I was also doing photo-narrative, you know, pieces, so that I could be doing lots of different things at once. And what Siri has been able to do is to take all those works that look decidedly different, particularly to, most audiences, and somehow, more than I can do, made a real, like you say, a real narrative out of it and makes them look like they all belong together. And that was part of the goal, I know, and it certainly works. That I think that stuff that didn't look like art then now looks like art, but it also fits with newer work that, has a different look, and it's not a big giant group show.
Right. I mean, it was one of the things that kind of has been the defining characteristic in a way, is how your work has been discussed, but even how you've discussed it yourself, is that things don't look the same. That they're coming at, different, at the problem from very different perspectives. I mean, and one of the things that we didn't even touch upon is the kind of literary aspect of your work, which is such an important one. But it's definitely reflected, upstairs as well.
Well, I never wanted to be pigeonholed as one thing or another, even though now, people say conceptual art. Well, we didn't have those terms at the time anyway, or at least not at the very beginning. But, I can remember that after I did Al's Cafe, and then I did Al's Grand Hotel, and then everybody said, well, what are you going to do next? Al's department store or whatever. And I knew that's the end of that. No more of that stuff. Yeah. People got the idea. That's good enough. Now let's move on to something else. Mm-hmm. And that's true of every kind of, series or body of work or whatever. That over a number of years, okay, that's understood. Now let's move on. Mm-hmm. So then 50 years looks quite different when you put it all together.
Right.
But that's just the nature of the person I am, and also the idea that what kind of art you want to make. You don't want to make the same thing forever. How boring is that? And so I think that's probably been in there from the very beginning.
Right. Do you think it also goes to this point of, kind of adopting different roles, like the reader or the kind of the collector, all of these things has been a way to also kind of keep yourself interested in the activity? Well,
yeah, you want to, if you want to keep your curiosity, so there's always something new out there to like find out about. And it's not that I think I'm adopting roles. Mm-hmm. I don't think of it that way. It's just, okay, I'm interested in that now. Mm-hmm. And then a whole new world opens up, and then all new work comes out. So I don't think I'm a collector, or I'm a this, or I'm a that. I'm not a writer. I don't ever think that I'm a writer. I use words, but I'm certainly not a writer. Mm-hmm. And so it's like that.
Well, especially with, Picture of Dorian Gray and Walden. I mean, I think of you as somebody who's inhabiting, you're more of a scribe than a writer, as Susan Morgan pointed out, for instance. And that's a very different relationship to those literary sources that also kind of enter into your work. It's very similar to even just copying books, book covers and things like that.
Well, that scribe is a good word for that, but copying is the key word. And that's been from the very beginning, that the things are out there already that are really great. And I think Bob Berry said there's enough artworks out there, I don't need to make any more, something like that.
Hubler, no?
Huh?
Was it Hubler?
No, I think Bob Berry said that. Or maybe Hubler said it. I don't know, one of the two. Okay. Anyway, so I think there's already great stuff out there. It's just a matter of finding it and being able to translate it, so then it becomes, noticeable.
Right. Well.
Time's up.
Well, I mean, you tell me.
Well, I guess.
That's pretty good. I think we
think it's all
covered
right.
some good ground.
Yeah, it's almost an hour.
Okay.
45 minutes. That's
Pretty
enough.
good. Okay. Well, Al, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thanks.
And for sharing this, this body of work, this life work.
Well,
with
we
us.
have to thank Siri for, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you so much for sharing this conversation with us. We've decided today that we would not do a Q&A. Instead, we thought it fitting that we include a special tribute to Al to close this program. And who better to do this than Terry Allen? So he is a celebrated visual artist and songwriter and has written and worked in both radio and theater. He has received such distinctions as the Guggenheim and NEA Fellowships, the Bessie and Isadora Duncan Awards for text, music, sets, and costumes for pedal steel at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and recently the first Townes Van Zandt Songwriter Award in 2017. His work has been shown throughout the U.S. and internationally in such exhibitions as Documenta and the Whitney, Sao Paulo, Paris, and Sydney biennials. And his work is represented in major private and public collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, MoCA in Los Angeles, and the L.A. County Museum of Art, also in Los Angeles. Terry Allen has recorded 13 albums of original songs, including classics Juarez and Lubbock for On Everything, and most recently the highly acclaimed Bottom of the World. His songs have also been recorded by such diverse artists as Bobby Bare, Little Feat, David Byrne, Ricky Nelson, Guy Clark, and Lucinda Williams. His music for films includes the soundtrack for Jane Anderson's Emmy-nominated The Baby Dance. A monograph on Terry Allen was published by the University of Texas Press in May of 2010. Terry has a few other important distinctions that are relevant to what was going on today. He is one of Allen Ruppersberg's oldest friends, having attended Chouinard together in the late 1960s. He appears as both a friend and a character in many of Al's photo works. In the gallery, you'll find Ruppersberg's video, A Lecture on Houdini for Terry Allen. Terry's music was featured in 1969 as part of Al's Cafe, and he was the performer featured on opening night of Al's Grand Hotel in 1971, where he also recorded an album. So I believe today Terry is going to revisit that time with a few tunes in celebration of Al and the show. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Terry Allen to the Walker stage.
It's worth it seeing your face. California, gonna leave tomorrow, leaving this town, all of this sorrow behind me. Yeah, my heart's been burned from the lessons I learned behind me. I'll be thumbing a ride in some beat up old truck. I'm going to California, gonna change my luck. I'm grieving. Yeah, my heart's been sad, the evil, I'm bad, I'm dreaming. Hell, I'm going California, gonna California, gonna seek out some glitter, bury my sadness there cold and bitter behind me. Yeah, my heart's been burned from the lessons I learned behind me. You can ask me the reason that I gotta go, but a little girl on D Street is bound to know, so just ask her. I've been moving along to the honky-tonk dawn right past her. Yeah, I'm going California with the snakes in my mind. When I get there, everything will be fine, so I'm scheming. I'll smile when I reach a strip of plush promise beach, but I'm dreaming. Yeah, I'm going California, gonna leave tomorrow. We're leaving this town, all of this sorrow behind me. Ah, my heart's been burned from the lessons I learned behind me. Thanks. That was the first song I ever recorded, and these people paid for me to do 500 copies of it, and we went in the studio and the band and made the song with a little flip side song, and they were going to use it as a demo to send out to various record stores and radio stations. And there was a guy at the same time called the Hollywood Arsonist that was going around L.A. starting little fires in different places. And one of the fires he started was on top of my stack of records, my 45. And it burned all of the records up except about 50 of them. So we thought this would make a great collector's item, you know. So collector's item, you know, and Al were like same thing, same time, you know. So he had the cafe going at that time, and it was the Blue Plate Special at the cafe. So that was the first time I ever sold records along with his plates of food. And I don't know, I have to tell this story too about the cafe. It was one of the first places in LA where artists from all these different areas, LA was pretty fractured at the time, still is, but all these artists from the Valley, from Pasadena, from Silver Lake, from the beach, downtown, they would come and congregate at the cafe. And Al was a cook who cooked up these artworks, and everybody had a menu and sat down, and you could order like a patty melt, which would be a 8x10 of Patty Page with melted marshmallows on it, or BLT, which is branches, leaves, and twigs, a plate of that. And also you could have a beer. So, and unfortunately Al did not get a beer license. So I don't remember how many weeks it was up, but the cops shut down the cafe, and Al had to go to court. And I'm sorry this court procedure wasn't filmed, because he had hair halfway down his back, and went before this judge, who was a woman, very severe-looking woman. And he started, you know, when he was called up, he started explaining his cafe, what he was doing, you know, how he was making these plates of art, and all these people were coming, and this woman just kept looking at him. And then finally she just said, "Get out of here." The trial of the century, right? Some time ago, back on the East Coast, in New York City to be exact, a bunch of artists and painters and writers and dancers and musicians and architects all started feeling real superior to their ego counterparts out on the West Coast. So they all got together and they hired a truck. And it was a big, white, spanking, shiny, new cab-over Peterbilt with mud flaps, AM and FM radio, leather seats, and a naugahyde sleeper. And they had American flag decals, all fresh, new on the side. And then on the side of the door, there was Art Arc in solid 24 karat gold leaf type. And they filled up this truck with the most influential heaps and significant piles of artwork ever assembled in modern times. And they sent it west to chide, humble, and humiliate the Golden Bear. And this is a true story of that truck. He held a truckload of art. New York City came rolling down the road. And the driver was singing, our sunset was pretty, but the truck turned over and she rolled off the road. Yeah, a truckload of art is burning near the highway. Precious objects are scattered all over the ground. Oh, a terrible sight if a person were to see it, but there weren't nobody Well, the driver went sailing high in the sky, landing in the gold lap of the Lord, who smiled and then said, son, you're better off dead than hauling a truckload full of hot avant-garde. And a truckload of art burning near the highway, precious objects scattered all over the ground. Oh, a terrible sight if a person were to see it, but there weren't nobody around. Yes, and beautiful artwork was thrown burning to the ground. Tragically landing in the weeds, and the smoke could be seen bar for miles all around. Yeah, but nobody knows what it means. Yeah, the truckload of art was burning near the highway, and a tough job for the highway patrol. They'll soon see the smoke come running to poke, then dig a deep ditch and throw the arts in a hole. Yeah, a truckload of art is burning near the highway, and it's raging far out of control. And what the critics have cheered is shattered and queered, and their noble reviews have been stewed on the road. Yeah, a truckload of art is burning near the highway. Precious objects are scattered all over the ground. Oh, a terrible sight if a person were to see it, but there weren't nobody around. Yeah, one of the first times I ever sang that song was at Al's Hotel. I was talking to Doug today, and I remember somebody asked me once what my definition of art was. And the first thing that popped out of my head was to get out of town. And I still totally believe that. It just depends on what levels you're trying to get out of town on. But Allen I met, he came from Cleveland, Ohio, and I came from Lubbock, Texas. And there was this kind of convergence of these not particularly like-minded people, but people that were driven by some necessity, probably at the time they didn't understand, to make something or to do something. And there was a group of people that became very close, and that's continued over a long time. And it's been one of the real valuable things, I think, in my life. And I think it's funny with Al's work, because you can talk about, all of the incredible innovations and things that are going on, but there's a real thread of friends through this work, and I think it's something that's so kind of meaningful, at least for me and people that have kind of been on this long ride all together. So I wanted to finish with a song that great artist, songwriter Guy Clark wrote, and it's just called Old Friends. It's like when you're making conversation, trying not to scream, trying not to tell them you don't care what they mean. You're really feeling fragile, really can't get home, really feel abandoned. You want to be alone. Old friends shine like diamonds. Old friends you can always call. Old friends, Lord, you can't buy them. You know it's old friends. After all. When the house is empty, the light begins to fade. Nothing to protect you except the window shade. Hard to put your finger on the thing that scares you the most. Hard to tell the difference between an angel and a ghost. Old friends shine like diamonds. Old friends you can always call. Old friends, Lord, you can't buy them. You know it's old friends. After all. Congratulations, old friend.